Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm going to be discussing this book, Harvest of Empire. This is a revised edition. It is subtitled A History of Latinos in America, written by Juan Gonzalez, and I really liked this book. Though I should say this was technically used. I didn't purchase it myself, and it was handed to me by a Santa Fe public schools, it might have been a charter school employee. I think it was the principal of that school who was bringing along these books for, I guess, my understanding was that the warehouse had a surplus of these books, and because the company I was working for was centered on outdoor education, they brought a few of these along, and while hosting the school and those students on a overnight experience, I also we were feeding them chili. It was chili and sour cream and cornbread, and I forget something else. But I stopped to ask this lady, who I didn't know was the principal at that time. I asked her, "What's that book you're reading?" And because it looked interesting to me. And she said it was Harvest of Empire, and she had an extra copy just in case anyone at the company I was with wanted a copy. And this is the first edition was 2000, and this is copyright 2011. Uh, I got this book in 2019, so it's been 7 years on my bookshelves. But when I read this, I was just fascinated. The way this book is organized is by a long form history of Latin America. And it starts with part one, Roots, Las Raíces, uh, starting with effectively a long form history. Chapter one, Conquerors and Victims, covers the years 1500 through 1800. The Spanish borderlands and the making of an empire covers the years 1810 to 1898, and Banana Republics and Bonds, Taming the Empire's Backyard, covers 1898 through 1950. And part two, Branches, Las Ramas, covers Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Cubans, Dominicans, Central Americans, and Colombians and Panamanians. And then part three, Harvest, La Cosecha, covers the return of Juan Seguin, Immigrants Old and New, Speak Spanish, You're in America, Free Trade, and Puerto Rico, USA Possessed and Unwanted. And this book enlightened me to a lot of the issues between Latin America and the United States of America, because a lot of the great minds of the United States of America claimed to be inspired by utopia and thinkers from the Enlightenment era. However, in Latin America, there were also a lot of democracy-minded individuals that were charismatic and could bring people to their cause, but the United States of America, still a fledgling nation, but powerful and able to beat, with help, to stall the British long enough that aid could come in the form of the French, and later were able to push back the British in the War of 1812 and to assert themselves on an international stage to say, hey, we aren't going away. This wasn't a one-time revolution. We are here to stay. And then I liked to think of myself as a socially aware and historically aware individual. And at the time in 2019, I had taken some courses that informed me about more in-depth history. And I was 2 courses away from getting a associate's degree in history. I chose not to because I just wanted my schooling to be over without paying any more money. And so I was aware at the time of incidences like the Bisbee deportation, which I covered in a history course that focused on the United States of America, the home front from 1915 to 1945, or in effect just before World War I through the end of World War II. And that was an impressive history course for many reasons, but one of them was learning about the Bisbee deportation, which was this incident where mostly Mexican immigrant workers, ones who were citizens of the United States of America, but had been immigrants from Mexico, they were in a copper mine near the Arizona Mexico border, and they were threatening to go on strike if they were not getting their demands met. And then the mostly Irish and German and American communities expelled all of the men, woke up in the middle of the night, effectively lynching. It was a lot of men woken up in the middle of the night at gunpoint and told, get out of your house. They weren't allowed to get their wallets. They weren't allowed to get dressed. They were gathered up and put on a train heading east to New Mexico and told, don't come back to Arizona or we'll expel you again. Don't come back to Bisbee or we'll shoot you. And a lot of the women and kids weren't given any way to contact their men. And so a lot of the women and children ended up going west to Los Angeles and San Diego. And it wasn't a lot of people that this happened to, but it was enough that, going into that history course, I didn't know about it. Coming out of that history course, I did know about it, and other labor disputes and ways in which the US had stamped that out. So, like I was saying, I kind of knew some of that history going into this book, but what I didn't know was, to expand on that, I guess, I knew that the US had been heavily involved in Latin America throughout the years. In the past, I worked with children of immigrants and immigrants themselves at a Burger King where it was Nicaraguans who weren't able to be home because of stress in their home country, Salvadorans who, I think one of them, his parents were political refugees and he himself was like 6 when they moved. There were some other refugees just from a lot of the stresses back home, Hondurans, and a lot of Central Americans at that Burger King that I worked at. All of them citizens, all of them, or at least permanent residents, all of them legally working in the United States of America. And a lot of them, their home countries had been destabilized by CIA actions. And I knew conceptually that the US had been actively involved in Latin America for at least 60 years, this being around 2014, 2015, at least 60 years. So I knew about that, 70 years if you count the extra years after working at Burger King and picking up this book. I knew that the CIA had been involved. What I didn't know was how uninvolved the United States of America had been with Latin America, despite. So, the Spanish Empire was significantly weaker than the British Empire, and even if they didn't need military help, these Latin American revolutionaries requested political help to be acknowledged by these Americans to say, look, we want to build a democracy like you have. Can you please help us with that? And they were constantly turned away by those Americans. And I didn't know that much, but Harvest of Empire informed me about that. There were there was history lessons in this book about kind of, as it says in that section, it says the years covered are like 1898 to 1950. These banana republics where once these countries had found stability and were kind of inviting in foreign investment, these banana republics, and again, it really, not again, but, and many people have mentioned it in the past, but the fact that there's a major US company named after one of our cultural atrocities is insane. I don't know how else to put it. But these businesses then asked the US military to enforce their will on these smaller countries. Oh, these people are starting to take some of our land, bring in Marines, destabilize the country, install new people that can honor and respect our private holdings, and so on and so forth. It wasn't just the CIA that was involved with Latin America, it was business interests. The Confederacy was interested in helping it out, and the southern states before the Civil War were interested in expanding south because the Union, the northern states, had made a deal that no slaveholding state could be established north of a certain latitude. And what that meant was the southern states started looking southward. If they couldn't expand slavery north of a certain latitude, then there was most of the world, because they were in the northern hemisphere, there was all of the southern hemisphere they could expand into, and everything close to the equator. So there were southern interests that wanted to expand south and take over these fledgling Latin American nations rather than help them develop their own societies. And a lot of these Latin American countries abolished slavery decades before the United States did. And then Harvest of Empire also expands into Spanish and American interactions, how the word filibuster, as we use it pretty frequently in American politics, was descended from a Spanish word, filibusteros, who were people that would swear off their American citizenship or something like that. They would declare themselves as establishing a new nation south of the United States borders because they had some grievance with the way things were run in the South. And so they would go south of Georgia into Florida, conquer a nearby Spanish settlement, one that didn't have too many Spanish people in it, and certainly didn't have enough Spanish garrison to defend it from these 50 to 100 men with guns. And so they took over that land, and it would usually be, say, 10 miles away from the border. They would go down there, take over that settlement, that town, and then when the Spanish came back like a month or two later with force of arms and a bigger garrison, these rebellious 50 to 100 or so men would then ask for help from the American government, saying, look, we're American citizens, these Spanish are trying to bully us, can you please send help? And so the US expanded territory incrementally until eventually they just purchased portions of the Spanish Empire outright. And this practice happened primarily, it was mostly effective in what would become the lower 48, but it was also done in further south regions, south of Mexico into Central America. And so just the history portion of this book was fascinating and taught me many things I didn't know about my home country that honestly kind of made me ashamed of how, you know, none of my ancestors were involved in this. All of my ancestors were in other nations until the 1900s. So Italian family members came over in the tail end of the 1890s. Uh, Mexican ancestors came over in after 1910 and through 1950, I think. And for one great grandparent, the border crossed her family. She was Tejano and then became Texan. Uh, Her family, at least, became Texan. She was born after 1900, and so she was born fully Texan and American. But these things that America used to do still have lasting effects on Latin America. And Harvest of Empire really goes into the nitty gritty of how the U.S. shaped Central America, the Caribbean, Mexico, uh, the north part of South America, how we could have helped them, and how we didn't because it wasn't in our business interests, it wasn't in our political interests. And, some of that, you're not a revolutionary isn't entitled to help from another political power. But if we're going to present ourselves as this city on a shining hill, and that's what the colonials, before we became the United States of America, that's what we were doing with our colonies, was creating this city on a shining hill. And that idea has sustained itself through most of American history. And if we are going to present ourselves as that shining city on a hill, then we should also help uplift other people to be able to enjoy those privileges as well. And instead, Harvest of Empire really emphasizes that the United States of America advertises itself as a certain thing, but then refuses to allow others to reap those rewards, to come in and enjoy those benefits. And even if you say, well, they shouldn't enjoy those benefits until they've worked for it, we don't treat our immigrants, legal or illegal, we documented or undocumented, we don't treat our immigrants respectfully. We assume that they're not here legally, and conservative media will go on and on and on about all these immigrants, and ignorant adults create ignorant kids that will tell immigrants of all sorts, regardless of their legal status, go back to your country. My parents aren't even immigrants, and I heard that from ignorant kids on the playground in a suburb of Washington, D.C., where there were only a handful of Hispanic kids at that school, and of them, mine was one of the more obvious Hispanic names. And, we don't treat Hispanics well in this country. We say, go back to your country. We don't want you here all the time. But we advertise ourselves as this great and prosperous land while keeping everyone south of our borders from ever getting even any of the scraps. And that is, in my mind, immoral. If we are going to be a force for good on Earth in this world, then we should help uplift everyone else. And time and again, as this book shows, the U.S. Keeps immigrants down, keeps foreigners down. That's really disappointing. While reading this book, and I've kind of skimmed it again before doing this rant, I am reminded of books that I have covered on this channel, such as Brown, The Last Discovery of America. And very, that being a very personal account and biography of an immigrant's children. There was Returned, which was more about immigrants, undocumented immigrants in the United States of America. But even that, all those people saw America as something they should aspire to and are turned away. And yes, there are legal ways for them to come through the border, but a lot of them were born here, or if they weren't born in the United States, they were brought over when they were toddlers, infants. They don't have any memories of their birth country. They primarily speak English with a heavy accent, but they don't speak Spanish fluently, and so they get returned to their birth country, but they don't fit in either the US or their birth country. And so, Harvest of Empire, Returned, Brown, there are other books on my bookshelves that have this kind of theming to it. The United States has been a less than ideal, at best, less than ideal neighbor to its Latin American neighbors south of its borders. And Harvest of Empire really emphasizes that, and I think that principle that gave me this book, because it really opened my eyes to a lot of those concerns. I know it can be a thick and dense book. It's 300 pages of very small font and very little joy that can be found in it. A lot of it is depressing to some degree. But I thank her for giving me this book because, like I said, it opened my eyes, and I have been reading similar books. I don't think I would have ever picked up Returned off the shelves if I had not first read Harvest of Empire. And all of these books shape me, my outlook, my mindset, my life. And I'm pretty happy that I got this book. It is information dense. It can be a slow read, but it is worth it if you are trying to educate yourself on the concerns of America, of Latin America, and of the world. So, yeah. My name's Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.